All right, let me ask you something. What could possibly connect the first African in space with the healing of an entire nation, a nation torn apart by decades of brutal racial conflict? Seems impossible, right? Well, it turns out there is a connection. It's a single powerful African philosophy, and it has some incredible lessons for all of us today. It's called Ubuntu.
I mean, it really is a fascinating puzzle when you think about it. On one hand, you've got Mark Shuttleworth, a tech entrepreneur who becomes the first African to go to the International Space Station back in 2002. And on the other hand, you have this monumental, almost impossible task of rebuilding a country just shattered by apartheid. So what's the thread that ties these two completely different stories together?
The answer, as you just saw, is Ubuntu. Now, for Shuttleworth, it was pretty clear. He saw this amazing parallel between the global teamwork that got him into space and this incredible African philosophy. So he named his open-source operating system Ubuntu to capture that spirit, that idea of shared humanity and building something together. But, and this is the important part, the real power of Ubuntu goes way beyond just technology.
So what does this word Ubuntu actually mean? Well, let's dive into that. The direct translation might seem simple, but believe me, the philosophy behind it, that's where things get really deep.
Okay, so at its most basic level, the word Ubuntu literally translates to humanity. Simple enough, right? But that one word, wow, it just unpacks this incredibly rich and complex worldview, all about how we're connected to each other. And nobody explained this better than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He put it so beautifully. He said that a person with Ubuntu understands that their own humanity is fundamentally completely tied to the humanity of everyone else. It's this idea that I am because we are. We're all part of this greater whole. My well-being is completely tied up in your well-being.
And what Tutu and others did was really powerful. They took this ancient African philosophy, which comes from oral tradition, and they wove it together with Christian theology. Specifically, the idea that every single person is created in the image of God. And what you get is this incredible framework, one that's built on empathy, on forgiveness, on restorative justice. It's a way of thinking that chooses healing over revenge every single time and puts our shared humanity way above rugged individualism.
Now, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. This framework was about to be put to the ultimate test. The year is 1994, apartheid has just fallen, and South Africa is standing at a terrifying crossroads. It was a choice, really, between revenge for all the horrors of the past or finding a shared path forward, together.
The whole world was watching, and pretty much everyone expected South Africa to go the route of the Nuremberg trials, a system all about punishment and retribution. But that's not what happened. Instead, the nation chose a completely different path, one guided by the spirit of Ubuntu. They created something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. And just look at the difference here. The goal wasn't punishment, it was healing. The method wasn't prosecution, it was listening to victims' testimony. The entire focus shifted, away from just punishing the bad guys, and towards restoring a deeply broken community.
And you might think this was purely a high-minded moral choice, but it was also incredibly pragmatic. See, as Archbishop Tutu explained, the conflict didn't end with a clear winner. It was basically a military stalemate. That meant neither side could really impose victor's justice on the other. A negotiated, restorative path wasn't just a nice idea. It was pretty much the only viable way to move forward without more bloodshed.
So the whole point of the TRC was never revenge. It was about creating a space, a national space, for brutal honesty and hopefully healing. The core idea, the absolute bedrock of the whole thing, was that the truth, the whole truth, had to come out, because without that, there was no foundation for real forgiveness or reconciliation. It just couldn't happen. And get this, the response was just staggering. By the 1997 deadline, something like 8,000 Amnesty applications had been filed. And these weren't just from one side. They came from all sides of the conflict. State security agents, members of the liberation movements who had attacked civilians, everyone. It was truly a national reckoning.
Okay, but it's easy to think of this as something from the history books, right? But Ubuntu isn't some dusty artifact. It is a living, breathing principle. And its power was tested in a huge way, very recently in a crisis that pushed modern South Africa right to the brink of what some were calling a new civil war.
So let's go to October 2020. In a small town called Senekal, a young farm manager is brutally murdered. And this single act just ignites a powder keg of racial tension. Outraged farmers literally storm the local police station. A radical political party mobilizes its forces. Suddenly, leaders across the country are using the words civil war. The whole situation was spinning out of control, and fast.
But then, right in the middle of all this chaos, a local community leader, Pastor John Mathathel, saw a picture of the young man who was killed. And in that moment, something shifted for him. He looked past all the politics, all the anger, all the racial divides, and in his own powerful words, he said, "I saw a human being."
And acting on that simple, powerful recognition of a shared humanity, Pastor Matuli did something pretty remarkable. Instead of pouring more fuel on the fire, he did the opposite. He started reaching out to the leaders on both sides, the ones who were ready to fight. He organized meetings, prayer sessions, anything to find some common ground. And you know what? Incredibly, it worked. The very same groups that were on the verge of violence actually came together to help clean up their town.
So the story of what happened in Senegal, just like the story of the TRC decades before it, it holds this powerful lesson for all of us, way beyond South Africa. It's a lesson about what restorative justice can actually look like in the real world when things are messy and tense.
You know, Desmond Tutu always said that peace isn't just about the fighting stopping. That's not real peace. True, lasting peace has to be built on a foundation of justice. But that begs the question, right? What kind of justice? And this is where the restorative model offers such a powerful and different answer. When you break it down, the path of restorative justice is actually pretty logical. It's kind of a three-step process. First, you have to have repentance. That's acknowledging what you did wrong and the damage it caused. Step 2 is restitution. You have to actually try to make amends to the person you hurt. And only then, only after those first two things happen, can you get to the final, and maybe the hardest step, allowing the person who did the harm to be restored to the community.
And look, this spirit of reconciliation over pure revenge, it isn't unique to South Africa. Think about this. U.S. President Harry Truman, after World War II, when he was asked what he was most proud of in his presidency, he didn't say winning the war. His answer was about what came after the victory. He was proudest of how America defeated its enemies and then, and this is the crucial part, brought them back into the community of nations.
And there's this incredible, iconic sculpture at the United Nations that perfectly captures this idea. It was a gift from the Soviet Union, of all places, right in the middle of the Cold War. And it shows a man hammering a sword, a weapon of war, and turning it into a plowshare, a tool for growing food. I mean, it's just this powerful, universal symbol of transforming instruments of death into tools of life, our ultimate hope for reconciliation. Which really brings us back to today, to our own often divided world. In a time of so much conflict, maybe the most urgent lesson we can take from Ubuntu is this: seeing the human being in our adversary, even when it's hard. That isn't weakness. In fact, it might just be the most courageous and essential first step we can take to finally start turning our own swords into plowshares.